In Romans 12, verse 2, Paul writes this: "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of the world." I don't know how you found life over the last few months. Talking to friends and family, the experience we've all had during the outbreak of COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown has been varied and different. For some of us, the world has almost come to a standstill, hasn't it? Maybe painfully so. Days seem long and strangely like the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that. For others of us, life might seem even more hectic than it was before as we try and balance work with looking after a family who are now at home all the time, or as our jobs get more and more complicated because we have to find new ways of doing what seemed to be straightforward before. However it's been for you, we've all got this one thing in common. Life just isn't the same as it was a few months ago, is it? We have no choice but to change the patterns. And the question is, what are we going to change our patterns to? Do we even have a choice? So, one of the things I missed at the outbreak of the coronavirus was being able to go on this, and this is my paddleboard. I don't know if you've seen them out on the ocean, but the idea of the paddleboard is you stand on it, and it's a bit like punting. You put your oar in the water, and instead of rowing, you pull yourself along. And if you do it, then you serenely, beautifully travel across the sea. Well, that's the idea of it, anyway. And sometimes, when I'm out on my paddleboard, I like to stop paddling and literally just sit or kneel down on my paddleboard and just rest on the ocean. It's really peaceful, just not going anywhere at all. But that's not entirely true, because you see, the ocean has its currents and its pools, and so we might think that we're standing still, but you're always going somewhere. And if you're not careful, I look up as I'm sitting on my paddleboard and find that I've been taken places that I never really wanted to be at all. And I think that's a little bit like the rhythms of life. We get pulled in the currents of life, and if we're not careful, we think we're standing still in life, but actually we're not. We're going places that we never really planned to go to at all. When my life was interrupted, like we've all been by COVID-19, I began to realise the patterns my life were following were not the ones I planned it to at the beginning. I've been moved by the current, a little bit at a time. And I wasn't where I thought I was because, well, I hadn't even really looked up. Does this sound familiar to any of you? Life before COVID, I'd leave my house in the morning and I'd love to stop and chat with my neighbours in the street, but, well, I find I don't have the time. So I jump in the car because there's no time to walk, and then I drive sometimes too fast because I'm already late for where I needed to be. I spend too long trying to pick the shortest checkout queue in the supermarket just to shave a few precious seconds of time for something I forgot to buy when I did have the time because I was too busy thinking about something else. And then, I'm so tired by the evening, I waste time watching a screen I'm not even taking in because I'm already planning the next day in my head. You see, I thought this was probably a time in my life when I was just standing still. I wasn't really going anywhere. But the truth is, you never just stand still. We're always heading somewhere. We're always in a current. Where has life's current taken you? So this morning I get to introduce to you the theme of our new series here at Upton Vale, and the theme is this: reset. And I'm particularly excited about this theme. Why? Well, a few weeks ago, myself, my wife Ellie and our older daughter Rebecca, we went on a prayer walk as part of the 24/7 prayer week at Upton Vale. And we walked here in the beautiful country park here of Cockington. We're so blessed to live in this amazing part of the country, aren't we? And as we were walking and praying, we agreed that we would just stop for a few minutes and try and listen to what God had to say to us. Now, I've already probably shown you that I'm not much of a stopper and a listener, and so you can imagine how thrilled I was by this prospect, but we gave it a go, and so for a few minutes we walked along silently, trying to hear what God might want to say to us. At the end of those few minutes, we stopped, and we all looked at each other, and we had the same word on our lips. The word was reset, pressing the reset button. It was an amazing experience. So for a few minutes here this morning, I'd like to look at Romans 12, 1 and 2 and pick out a few things that this passage tells us about this idea of reset. And I'd like to look especially at 3 key words. The first word I want to look at this morning is right at the very start of this passage in Romans 12. How's this start? Therefore. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. For those of you that have ever studied maths or are now trying to teach your children maths in lockdown, the mathematics symbol for therefore is 3 dots, isn't it? It goes dot, dot, dot. And I think that's really helpful because the Greek word used here in this passage is oun and is often used in Greek to show how the dots connect, to take an explanation and put it into practice. Therefore, literally joining the dots between an idea and actually doing it. We see this earlier in the Bible. Matthew 6, Jesus is teaching the disciples how to pray during the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus first gives an explanation. He says, don't pray using lots of big complicated words. It's not about showing off to other people. It's about an audience of one with God. And then Jesus joins the dots. He uses this Greek word oun and says, Matthew 6 verse 9, therefore, because of what I've just explained, this is how you pray. And off he goes with the practical, Our Father, who art in heaven. But what's the therefore joining up in this passage? Because it begins right at the start of chapter 12, doesn't it? Well, the answer is everything in the book of Romans up to that point. You see, Paul has just explained a whole bunch of theology in Romans, and it's pretty chunky stuff if you read it. In Romans 1 to 8, Paul lays down the whole gospel. He explains how we, as God's creation, have messed up. And because we made ourselves king of our lives instead of God, because we've chosen to ignore God, because we've chosen to go our own way, our destiny is death. But then in Romans 5 verse 8, Paul reveals God's amazing plan to rescue us. Whilst we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so because Jesus has taken our punishment on himself, we're free to live, to have a relationship with God. And then Paul goes on in Romans 9 all the way to Romans 11. He explains that the rescue plan is not just for Israel, for God's chosen people of the Old Testament, but the gospel is now the good news for the whole world, for every one of us. And then Paul says, therefore, ... You see, the start of Reset is not asking what we can do to change. It's about realising what God has already done to rescue us. That's why in verse 2, Paul writes, we are transformed by the renewing of our minds. Now, I've got this verse wrong in the past because it sounds like something we do for ourselves. Being transformed by the renewing of the mind. It sounds like it's all about mental strength, willing myself to live in a different way. If only I have the willpower, I can be transformed. This is almost exactly wrong. You see, a better translation of the word mind is understanding. Be transformed by the renewing of your understanding. We're transformed when we realise, when we get what God has already done for us. Reset starts by realising that, as verse 1 tells us, in God's mercy, he saves us. Brilliant. So, the second word I want to look at this morning is the word sacrifice. And we can find it again straight away in Romans 12, verse 1. Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as what? As living sacrifices. Sacrifice. is not a word used in everyday language these days, is it? But in the first century Middle East, sacrifice was a major part of every religion going. Paul knows this, and he deliberately picks up on the language of the time. But what he's describing here is a very different kind of sacrifice. This isn't the sacrifice of a dumb animal, unaware of what's about to happen to it. This is the living sacrifice that comes about from joining those dots. This is the living, intentional sacrifice that says, because of God's great rescue plan for me, I'm going to say, Jesus, I'm yours. You see, reset demands a response. Yes, it starts with what God's done for us, but it leads to a change in direction from us. This is what Andy talked about when he spoke about the potter and the clay a few weeks ago. God doesn't force himself, his plans upon us, but we need to join the dots to say to God, God, in view of your amazing mercy, in what you've done for me, I'm sorry. I'm all yours. Pick me. On to the third and final word that I want to look at with you this morning. And is this word, will. It's found in verse 2. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing and perfect will. The Greek word used here for will is pretty much only used in the Bible when talking about God. And will can be translated as plans, or one I like even better, desires. Paul says that as we realise, as we understand what God has done for us, as we turn to God and say, hey, God, I'm sorry, I want to be yours, then we start to search for God's plans, his desires, instead of our own desires. The Bible makes it quite clear that God's plans for our lives, our church, our community are the best ones, much better than our own. We stop following the rhythms of the world and we start listening out for the rhythms of God's will, of God's desires, of God's heart. As I said at the beginning, we're always heading somewhere. There's always some pull on us. There's always some pattern or rhythm we're following. A long time ago, my youth leader Rob said to me that when it comes to following God, you can't sit on the fence. If you do, he said, Paul, you'll just get splinters in your bottom. If we're not following the rhythm of God's will, God's plan for our lives, we're going to end up drifting into other rhythms, whether we mean to or not. We're always travelling somewhere. Let me leave you with this story. When I was at secondary school, a friend of mine had an irregular heartbeat. Whilst most hearts go ba-boom, 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 his heart had a different rhythm that wasn't good. It wasn't doing what it was designed to do. Medication didn't change it, and in the end he was taken into hospital when they did this really clever thing. They gave his heart an electric shock, and it reset its rhythm the way it was designed to be. Do I believe that God, who loves his world, his creation, has sent COVID-19 to shock us into a new rhythm? No, I don't. But do I believe that God can take an awful situation and lead us, as it says in Isaiah 45, to treasures in the darkness? Absolutely. And I'm so excited about the opportunity we have now to reset some of the unhealthy rhythms in our churches, in our communities, in our world. Because some things couldn't have carried on the way they were for much longer. But if we want God to do something through us, we need to allow him to do something in us first. Reset has to start with me, not in my own power, but because ... God made the first move. COVID has been a shock to me personally. I didn't see it coming for a second. I'm a planner, and 2020 has not turned out the way I planned it in any shape, way or form whatsoever. But my prayer for me and my prayer for you is this: that as our rhythms are forced to change, we start to beat the rhythm of God's heart, God's desires, and not our own.